Right, so we're on to our last but not least section of today's panels, and I'm very pleased to welcome a panel presentation from, well, we've got three authors, two of whom are here today. So I'm pleased to welcome Professor Peter Mandaville from George Mason University, and Kadir Yildirim from Rice University, and they'll both be discussing the Umma in the time of Corona, exploring Muslim responses to COVID-19. Peter is Professor of International Affairs at the Shah School of Policy and Government and Director of the Ali Viral Al Center for Global Islamic Studies, both at George Mason Uni. Kadir is a fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Great, wonderful. Thank you very much, Gary, and many thanks to all of you for your stamina and for being the stalwart hangers-on to the very bitter end. Gary, very grateful to you for convening this and for serving as our brave live producer today. So we are grateful to have the opportunity today to share with you an overview and some initial findings arising from a fairly large-scale public opinion survey that we being myself, Tarek Masoud from Harvard University, and my colleague Kadir Yildirim from the Baker Institute at Rice University, who's co-presenting with me today, a survey that we fielded late last year that is trying to understand the sort of macro level picture sociologically in a number of large Muslim majority countries with respect to questions of how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected various aspects of Muslim religious life. The origins of the study came about through a number of conversations that Tarek, Kadir, and myself began having in the spring of last year, similar, I imagine, to conversations that many of you had as we began to see things like debates about the validity of prayers that, for example, Sana's presentation referred to today, not just with respect to Jumu'ah prayer, but also obviously the pandemic started, or the beginning of the pandemic corresponded closely to the advent of Ramadan last year. And so there were similar debates about the validity of praying Tarawih through a virtual medium such as Zoom. We also noticed interesting dynamics in terms of emerging contestations between religious institutions, religious actors, and state authorities around questions of access to religious sites and the permissibility of congregational prayer during a public health crisis. And so we had the opportunity, thanks to a grant from the Henry Luce Foundation, one of the private American-based foundations that supports scholarly work, which, like many of its peer philanthropic organizations, set aside some money around the time of the pandemic to kind of surge funding to research groups who wanted to begin to explore the implications of the pandemic for social life around the world. And so thanks to the support from the Henry Luce Foundation, we were able to field this survey. And so what we want to do today is to kind of give you an overview of some of the findings emerging from the project and give you a sense of what we hope to do with it over the coming year. So I'm going to hand over in a moment to Kadir, who will kind of describe the research design and give you an overview of some of our top line findings. And then in the second portion of our remarks today, I'll drill down in a little bit more depth with respect to one question or one issue that emerged very immediately. The sort of starkness of it in our data really leapt out at us when we looked at it, which is about the relationship between changes in religious behavior and experiences of anxiety, economic hardship in particular during the pandemic in the countries that we surveyed. So Kadir, let me hand things over to you at this point.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Gary, for including us in this panel. We're grateful. So next slide, please. So what we wanted to do, as Peter explained, was to get an idea within a Muslim context globally, how the pandemic has changed, affected religion and religiosity. To this end, we conducted an online survey with support from Luz Foundation. As Peter mentioned, in November, December of 2020, we had more than 9,000 adult respondents from 5 countries. And this was a completely online survey. The sample was not representative for obvious reasons. It's difficult to get a representative sample in an online survey because of the limitations of what kinds of panels survey companies run, unfortunately. But we were able to control a couple of things. One is even split between men and women in the survey in all countries. And also we focused on only Muslims, self-described Muslims in the survey to be able to get a better grasp of how religiosity was affected by the pandemic. In terms of age, slightly older than the population we would ideally like to have, but it's fairly close to normal, I guess, representative surveys. 31.2 on average, females, a little bit younger, males, a little bit older. So in addition to focusing on Muslims in general, we wanted to choose countries that would give us leverage in terms of the variation across the Muslim world. So we focused on 5 countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, and Indonesia. In selecting these countries, we wanted to make sure we were able to have variation in terms of state-religion relationship in certain countries, such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia, where we have the state as the prominent religious actor controlling the religious space pretty significantly. In some others, like Pakistan, for example, we have a fairly decentralized religious authority structure, and the state is not a major actor like it is in Saudi Arabia and Turkey. This selection of countries also gives us variation in terms of socioeconomic status. It gives us variation in terms of state capacity, which was important because this is a pandemic and we're talking about lockdown and controlling a health concern for a lot of people, which might potentially affect people's, whether people would turn to religion instead of state to address an important health and simultaneously economic concern. So next slide, please. So some of the major sort of top-line findings. One question we asked respondents was, whose guidance do you trust about what measures you should take to protect yourself from coronavirus? People could choose multiple options here. And what we are seeing here is that religious actors, such as Imam of your local mosque, Islamic preacher you follow online, Dar al-Ifta, do not get as much traction as a Ministry of Health, for example, would get, or state television and newspapers or international agencies get from the respondents, which is, I think, in a way, to some degree, a good indication that people pay attention to more relevant actors because this is a primarily health concern first and foremost. Next slide, please. So we, another question, compared to the period before coronavirus, would you say religion is more important to you now than it was before the pandemic, less important, or about the same? So at the top where it says base, the one 9,290 is the total number. That column represents, on average, 45% of the respondents say religion is more important. 46% say it's about the same religious importance. We have some variation among the 4 countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, and Pakistan. The one on the right is with the 2007 respondents is Turkey, and there we see Turkish respondents are indicating that their religion is much less important compared to other respondents in other countries, which we will see in the upcoming slides that is going to reveal itself in different ways as well, not just religion's importance broadly construed. Next slide, please. Okay, so we asked them about different kinds of policies that states enacted or considered enacting. So some of these policies involved closing borders to international travel, closing all non-essential businesses and enforcing lockdown, releasing prisoners to stop the spread of the virus in prisons, and increasing food subsidies for people to stay at home to fight the spread of the coronavirus. So we have the cross-country variation here. Most of the countries show very similar levels of support for these policies. One, release of prisoners is the one that people seem to be opposing the most across all countries. And these are not religious, I guess, policies that have a direct religious connotation. In the next slide, we're gonna see more religious policies that people respond fairly differently across different national contexts. Next slide, please. So we asked respondents to evaluate 2 statements, whether they agree or disagree. The first one is in red: instead of avoiding the mosques for fear of coronavirus, we should be gathering there to ask Allah for strength and forgiveness. This seems to get a lot of support across 4 countries: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Indonesia. By contrast, in Turkey, what we're seeing is more people oppose this or strongly oppose this particular statement than they support it. In the next statement, Muslims who insist on going to the mosque risk infecting others and are committing a grave sin, kind of the flip side of the first one. And here we see responses being reversed. In Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and in Indonesia, we see less support for this particular statement. And in Turkey, we see the complete opposite, an overwhelming support for this particular statement. And this gives us, I think, in some ways, we can attribute this to the relatively more secular nature of the Turkish society for historical reasons in the post-independence period. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have in this slide, we asked about various religious policies, with the exception of one, limiting family gatherings. So we asked them about canceling Friday prayers, canceling Taraweeh prayers, restricting Hajj, preventing daily prayers in mosques, restricting Umrah, and canceling Eid prayers. So here we have a couple of observations. We can make a couple of observations. So the question is, certain measures were taken to curb the spread of the coronavirus pandemic in your country. To what extent do you oppose or support each of these measures? What we're seeing is limiting family gatherings finds support pretty much in all countries, a little bit less in Indonesia, but nonetheless highest in all countries, in all 5 countries. In a couple of countries, particularly Saudi Arabia and Turkey, given the religious nature of these policies or proposed policies, what we're seeing is responses are more tightly knit together in those 2 contexts. In Turkey, those 6 policies are together, and in Saudi Arabia, they're fairly high and they're somewhat packed together. One reason why that might be the case is because of the, I think, overlapping message coming from both religious authorities and health authorities in both countries in support of these policies. Whereas say in Pakistan, on the opposite end, we see much less support, and they're fairly close together. It's a fairly decentralized religious authority structure. The state religious authority doesn't carry a whole lot of weight as opposed to local religious figures and authorities. That tends to sort of push people to oppose many of these policies. In part, this is something that has to do with the religious market structure in Pakistan, where many mosques and imams benefit from people's attendance in many of these activities, in mosque or related to mosques, congregational nature of these events, activities. So that's why we see significant opposition to these policies, reflecting religious authorities' opposition to these policies. Next slide, please. So we created an edited index of religious behavior. So we asked people in several questions about daily prayers, how much they pray compared to the pre-pandemic period, reading Quran, going to the mosque, reading religious books and watching or following religious programming on television or on satellite. So we combined them into a simple one index, additive index. And what we are seeing in this graph is that in 4 countries, we see a slight uptick in terms of people indicating that they're doing these things more often than they did before the pandemic. In Turkey, again, standing out from the rest, people indicating that they're doing these religious activities more or less about the same with the pre-pandemic levels. So if you want to dig deeper, a little bit deeper in terms of what these specific activities are in the next slide, we're seeing that daily prayers are higher now in the pandemic period. Quran is being read more. Religious books are read slightly more, and religious programs are being followed slightly more. And attending to mosque is less for obvious reasons. And religious lessons attendance to those is also less than what we observed in the pre-pandemic period. So when we combine those, this gives us a slightly above the average or pre-pandemic levels in terms of religious behavior, indicating that people turn to religion in the post-pandemic, during the pandemic level, period. I'll stop here and hand it over to Peter to go into the causal dynamics behind it.
Great, thanks very much, Kadir. And Gary, did I just see you popping up with the time warning there?
Yes, I did.
Okay, so I think that's the 5-minute warning, right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, great. So with the few minutes of time that we have remaining, I wanted to sort of drill down on one finding that sort of popped out at us when we did our initial review of the data, which led us in a direction we hadn't kind of originally intended to even go with the study, which was to try to use our data to answer an almost kind of classic sociological question about the relationship between people's experience of distress and insecurity and religion. In Durkheimian, Weberian, Freudian psychology and sociology, it's been a sort of standard bearer thesis that religion often functions as a balm in the face of perceived and experienced distress and insecurity. And we noticed that at the outset of the pandemic, there was a bit of a debate that broke out among some scholars of religion about what the overall impact of the pandemic on religion would be. Some scholars predicting that there would be a religious resurgence, that The crisis of the pandemic would cause people, by and large, to turn towards religion to seek hope and solace. Whereas others were predicting something like a religious recession, the idea that people's inability to participate, particularly in some of the community and social dimensions of religion, such as attending congregational worships, would lead people to de-emphasize the centrality of religion in their lives. And our data seem to suggest a very clear answer to this question. And so I just want to spend a couple of minutes going through that. First of all, we needed to establish whether or not people were indeed experiencing increased psychological distress. And what this graph shows you very clearly is that our respondents, by and large, indicated that in the immediate run-up to responding to our survey, they had indeed been experiencing nervousness, worry, apathy, and depression for at least several days. So the psychological distress factors seem to be present. We also wanted to understand the relationship between economic insecurity and psychological distress, among other potential drivers of distress. And what came through very clearly in our data is a very firm relationship between the two, as we can see here, whereby those who were either worrying about, and particularly those who were worrying about and actually experienced or reported increased economic insecurity as a result of the pandemic, we can see higher reported levels of psychological distress. So what we then do with that is to run it against the index of religious behavior that Kadir already provided an overview of. And this is where this very interesting finding popped out very, very clearly, which is that, again, as you can see here, among those who were worrying about and experienced loss of employment or greater socioeconomic insecurity, we see significantly higher change in religious practice. And as you saw from the data that Kadir showed, the overwhelming trend within that data of religious behavior change is in the direction of increased religiosity. But a second piece that jumped out at us very clearly that you can see here is a pattern whereby we see that those who are reporting higher levels of religious practice in the period running up to responding to our survey were also reporting lower levels of psychological distress, which suggests to us that religion and religious practice was indeed functioning precisely as the balm for psychological distress that kind of classic sociology would predict. Just a slide that gives you a brief summary of our findings here. If you're interested in reading a sort of brief write-up of this, I'm going to share in the chat box a link to a piece that Kadir, Tarek, Masoud, and I published in the Washington Post a couple months back that kind of is a slightly more in-depth analysis of this data. And I'm also including a link to a webinar series on COVID-19 and Muslim religiosity that the Ali Nur Al-Aqsa Center at George Mason University ran last year that a number of you were kind enough to present your research at. So with just 1 quick minute remaining, I wanted to give you a sense of what's next for our study. We will be doing a report on the initial data that we gathered last year, but I also wanted to let you know that we are just about to put out into the field a second survey that is designed to explore the relationship between religion and attitudes towards the COVID-19 vaccine. We want to understand to what extent and how religion may or may not have an impact on people's attitudes towards receiving the vaccine, and where they do express concerns based on religion about the vaccine, what is the more precise nature of the concerns that they express. So please look out for that. We're going to be also in that same survey repeating a question that appeared recently in the Afrobarometer, where people were asked to express their views about the relative effectiveness of prayer versus receiving the vaccine on preventing the spread of COVID-19. So hopefully this presentation provides something of a kind of big picture macro context for the incredibly rich kind of lived religion and ethnographic based presentations that we heard today. And so thanks again to all of you for your attention, and Gary for the invitation, and look forward to hearing any reactions or questions you might have.
Okay, that's been great. Thank you very much. I'm just waiting for the big screen to disappear there, but that was a really interesting analysis of some important data. And do follow up on the article. I did try to get the Washington Post article, but it's paywalled. I'm sure we can find a way around that. Yeah, it's very, really interesting materials.